Hi, and welcome to The Breakdown, your short, sweet, and digestible guide to the public policy issues facing Texas and the country today. I'm your host, Brian Phillips, with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. For more information on today's topic and just about any issue that you read about or tweet about or gather around the water cooler to discuss, you can find all of those issues, all the things that TPPF likes to talk about on those issues at texaspolicy.com. Today we're going to talk about the number one issue in Texas, the most important issue to voters in Texas: immigration and border security. Now, and that's not just my opinion. In fact, every single public poll that I've ever seen over the last 4 years, save a few months during the opening of the pandemic, and certainly any poll that we've done here at Texas Public Policy Foundation over the last couple of years, has shown that immigration and border security is the number one issue for Texans, and that of course goes left, right, and center. And by double digits. So to talk about that issue today, there's a lot of debate going on right now at the Texas Capitol. There's several bills, and we're going to talk about those today. With me to talk about that is TPPF's Chief of Intelligence and Research and our Director for Texas Identity, Josh Treviño. Josh recently testified during a debate over a number of the border security bills that we'll talk about today, making their way through the Capitol. So thank you, Josh, for being on Brian's Breakdown today.
Thanks, Brian.
Okay, so just go right to my lead in. It is the number one issue. I'm actually pretty fascinated by this because, I've done a lot of polling, and you see issues fluctuate by, how much the media pays attention to it, to, elections coming up and what are the candidates talking about. And in Texas, I'm not talking nationally, but in Texas, border security and immigration is always, always, always number one.
Oh, yeah.
Why is that?
I mean, partly it's a function, and that's the right question to begin with. Partly it's a function of just the sheer length of our international border. I believe we have the longest international border of any state. Somebody on the internet will fact check me on that, but I'm 99% sure.
I think that's right.
That's the case. And so that plays into it. Obviously, Texas also has a fairly unique history as a frontier area. It was a frontier area when the Spanish were settling it in the 18th century. It continues to be literally a frontier area now that it's on the U.S.-Mexico border. And then the third reason I would say that it's continually at the top of the list of concerns, not just for Texas conservatives or for Texas Republicans, but for Texans, period, is because of the existential nature of the question. Texans are not against migration. They're not against immigrants as such. Obviously, that's the case. You can go to any significant community in Texas, and you can see people from other places, whether they're from Vietnam or California right now. Texas is a very open state. But concurrent with that, Texans understand that the issue of who you allow to become part of your political community, your polity writ large, is literally an existential question. And so if you think about, there's really three things that any political community needs to control. One is going to be the understanding of its past, which is history and heritage. The other is going to be the shaping of the present, which is really going to be education and education reform, which is also a foundation subject that you've talked about many times. And then the third item is determining what the future is going to look like, which really gets into immigration, who joins your community and on what terms. The reality is that Texans understand, as I think most Americans understand too, that if you have no say over who becomes part of your political community, you don't really rule yourself. You're not really truly a sovereign and self-governing republic as conceived by either the American or Texas founders. And I think that's fundamentally why it matters. Now, layered on top of that all is the incredible level of dysfunction, criminality, and violence that's currently coming from Mexico right now. So you take this very grave and real philosophical concern that's felt and understood, I think, by the general population, and then you add to it the immediacy and the physicality and the realness of the violence that is present on the other side of the border and frequently comes across to our side of the border, and it just becomes outstandingly compelling.
So that's what I want to kind of dig into next is, so it is true that the plurality, I guess, of Texans, it's not quite a majority, will say this is number one issue, but then what are the issues within the issues, right? Like what is the debate? If we all agree that immigration and border security, it's not because we all agree that the border should be shut down or that the border should be open. It's actually,
right.
I mean, and some of the research that we've done, some of the polling and value laddering research that we've done shows that, like, even though you have a group of people who believe it's the number one issue, depending on where you stand on that issue, your opinion of what we should should do about it diverges almost immediately.
It does.
And so take us through, what you think like the real debate over the issues are, and kind of where people, believe this issue, like what are the real problems and what are the solutions for border security?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the topic is that it really reveals your priors, right? It really exposes kind of what you value and where you stand in terms of your ideas of what these very fundamental questions look like: democracy, patriotism, community, and so on. And so you do have this variety of views, even on the right, in prescriptions on what to do about border security and immigration writ large. There is a cohort, many of our friends on the left who sincerely hold to this, what I'll describe out of charity. I don't actually agree with this, but out of charity, I'll describe it as sort of a universalist view of mankind, that everyone has a right to come to the United States, everyone has a right to seek a better life and to have a better life here in the United States, and therefore there is no moral basis for denying entry into Texas or the United States or anywhere else. I fundamentally disagree with that. I think that's quite wrong, but it is adhered to by a lot of individuals, and certainly those of us who showed up for the HB 20 testimony got to hear from hundreds of them on that evening. Even on the right, though, you do have individuals who believe in what I'll describe as market-based solutions, who fundamentally see the issues at the border as essentially a labor market supply issue. I've been very sympathetic to this view myself in the past. And then you have another group, and I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but I'm happy to dig in wherever you want, Brian, on this. And this is where I personally stand. It's where the foundation is right now, who believes that a security-first approach is really what's needed. I'm not sure that was the case perhaps a decade ago, perhaps 15 years ago. I am sure it's the case now, and that is 100% because of what's happening in Mexico.
Yep, absolutely. And because of the security situation at the border is so much different than it was 10 years ago. And we'll talk about a little bit about why that is. But and before we get into what's going on in the Texas legislature, because and I really want to set that up, you've done a lot of, you've visited Mexico several times in the last couple of months. You've certainly done a lot of research on the relationship between Texas and Mexico over the last decades and how that's changed over maybe even the last 4 or 5 years. Can you give us, to the best of your knowledge and as bumper stickery as you possibly can, kind of an overview? Yeah, we only have so much time on the podcast, but give us an overview of maybe kind of where we're coming from with the Texas-Mexico relationship and where we are now.
Texas has always been frontier territory for Mexico, and that was true. I think I mentioned initially when Texas was first settled by the Spanish in the 18th century, and that continues to this day. My friend Don Frazier over at Schreiner University at the Texas Center there likes to point out that Texas was the only organically multicultural frontier of the 19th century in the United States, and that condition pertains and continues today. So what I would argue that we're seeing vis-a-vis Texas and Mexico right now is not something necessarily new in history. The idea of Texas as sort of a buffer between Mexico and the rest of the United States, subject to Mexican disorder and violence, is a theme that you see crop up again and again in both the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, we did take a holiday from history, so to speak, from about 1920 through about the last decade, in which Mexico was reasonably peaceful, reasonably well-governed. You have to put it in context. It was never well-governed. But at the same time, I remember growing up with a border that was relatively peaceful. You could cross over to have lunch, to shop, to do all sorts of things. Now, going to Matamoros for a tummy tuck, it's not a current concern for me, by the way, but it'll get half your party killed, literally. And so we just now see something that is very different within living memory, but not so different within historical memory, and that's something to keep in mind.
So, in terms of where we are now, what has the Texas-Mexico relationship? How has that contributed to the public safety issues that we're seeing on the border right now? Let's just talk about those, for example. We'll get into sort of the immigration problems and the border crossing here in a little bit. But what do you think? Is there seems to be some inflamed rhetoric that is now bubbling up on both sides of the border, really, about who's to blame or what, how much cooperation should happen between Texas and Mexico. How much of that is contributing to the chaos that's going on down there?
The rhetoric from the Mexican side is obviously unhelpful. Right now, the Mexican president is a left populist, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. He goes by AMLO, his initials, who is very invested in sort of this old line Mexican nationalism that's very anti-American, and it's explicitly anti-Texan. He's never had anything good to say about the Texans, and it's because he adheres to this sort of Mexican nationalist narrative that the Texans stole Texas. You can unpeel that on your own time.
Still angry about that.
Still angry about that. And certainly, if you go to the Museo Nacional de Historia in Chapultepec in Mexico City, you'll see that narrative unfolding that the United States sent in. This is literally on some of the signage there. Sent in colonists with the intent of stealing Texas. Set aside the preposterousness of the historical narrative, it's real and present in the current day. And so you have this. On the other side, I would argue that the Americans writ large, and not that our policy has been perfect by any stretch, but the American writ large have extended a tremendous amount of grace and forbearance to the Mexican side, particularly across the past 5 to 10 years. Mexico has a series of responsibilities, both moral responsibilities, prudential responsibilities, and also under international law, to not allow its territory to fall under the sovereignty of other actors, to not allow its territory to be used as a base to attack its neighbors. And it has done all those things, we would argue, unfortunately, willingly, especially with the current Mexican regime. And so when you look at the rhetoric and how it's heated up, and on the U.S. side, it is absolutely heated up, particularly in the past 60 days, I really interpret what's happening on the U.S. side as a long delayed and frankly overdue reaction, recognizing what's been going on south of the border.
Okay, so now I want to get into what everybody, the typical conversation that happens around this issue. And I'll do the bumper sticker version because everyone knows the story and the narrative already, which is that we had largely, depending on how you look at it, the most secure border that we've ever had in a long time at the end of the Trump administration. And that's probably just because we had a very unsecure border up until he started to do some things with Title 42 and remain in Mexico and all those sort of things. Yeah. So we'll go ahead and give him the benefit of the doubt that they had the most secure border in history, but it certainly is not that way now. Almost literally to the day that Biden got into the administration, he reversed some of the biggest decisions that the Trump administration had made on immigration and almost single-handedly turned this into a massive crisis. We see, in a calendar year, we had over 2 million border encounters of people coming across, which is more than we've ever had in any 12-month period in history, and not to mention all of the gotaways and others that have gone through. So we've created this massive crisis, right? So skip forward. So now, Texas is looking at this. Governor Abbott is looking at this. The leaders and our policymakers in Texas are watching this happen, and they're asking for help. They're doing whatever it is that they're supposed to be doing to say, federal government, do your job, send in more resources, hire more people, we need more security. And of course, none of that's coming. None of that's going to happen.
None of it, yeah.
And so what it feels like now, and you tell me, because you talked to folks up at the Capitol, and you obviously have testified up there on these bills and helped craft some of these bills and some of these legislation, is the feeling then that that there has finally been an acceptance after last couple of years that the help is not coming, Biden's not going to do his job, and so we as Texas policymakers have to step up and figure out what it is that we can do within the bounds of the law, within the bounds of the Constitution. What can we do in Texas in terms of protecting our sovereignty, protecting our borders, protecting our communities? Take us through a little bit of that decision process that happened, because I know it was it's not like they just decided one day, hey, we need some bills and we're going to go secure our border. There's a process involved here in making sure that these things will not only be the right policy, but also stand up to constitutional muster. And I know you know a lot about that.
Yeah, thank you. Now, I think that when we look back on this, probably in a year or two, and hopefully when a lot of this good legislation has been passed, that there will be a case study in kind of the positive role that good lawmakers and good think tanks like the Foundation can actually play in transforming the perception of policy. I will say that just over 6 months ago, when Foundation President Greg Sindelar went to Mexico City, delivered a keynote address at the American Society of Mexico's 80th anniversary gala, calling for a Texas invasion declaration vis-a-vis Mexico, which strangely enough was popular in the room. I was surprised to see that. We can talk about that if you want to. But at that point,
we'll get to invasion for sure. Not going to leave that one.
No,
just for our listeners to know.
But just as an example, at that point, I would argue in September 2022, that was an out there idea. That was not in kind of the window of political possibility. It was somewhere over here. Now, as you and I are talking in kind of the latter half of April 2023, it is squarely within the conversation. And a few things have happened to make it possible. One, obviously, is DC's just incredible chronic inaction and really contempt for requests for help by the Texas public and the state of Texas. And the other is kind of the Mexican regime feeling more and more unleashed to say and do things that were candidly unthinkable before. And Texas lawmakers, I think, rationally have responded to that. And I am incredibly heartened at the things that they are willing to consider and contemplate in a thoughtful and considered way that they weren't before.
And now we're going to get into that, because that's what we do here on the breakdown, is we try to get into the weeds so people know what these bills and what this legislation really does. The bill that seems to make all the headlines, the one that maybe is the most controversial, but also is really the most reasonable response to the border security situation, I think is HB 20. And this is the one that creates the Border Protection Unit. I mean, this is the one that directly responds to, we don't have the resources we need to protect these communities coming from the federal government. So we in Texas now need to start creating a new unit. We need to be funding it and resourcing it and hiring people to come and be the people who are going to enforce the law in these communities. So talk to us about HB 20. I know this was one of the ones that you testified on the other day. So take us through that bill and kind of what the intent is and what you hope the outcome will be.
Yeah, HB 20 obviously has gotten a lot of the stray voltage from the left, I think is how I'll put it. It's the one that the left and kind of the Texas Democrats seem to be willing to go to the mat for, because it does specifically create this Border Protection Unit. I think that legitimately recognizes that border protection and the crisis at the border is a unique security and law enforcement concern for the state of Texas that requires a dedicated apparatus. Hitherto, under Operation Lone Star, which we're supportive of, by the way, so we're glad Governor Abbott saw fit to do it. It was the right thing to do. But it draws upon resources that are either not really designed for border protection, for example, DPS, or resources that are easily federalizable, like the Texas National Guard. In the long run, you cannot have DPS and or the Texas National Guard focused upon border security 24/7.
Right.
It's a legitimate mission for them, don't get me wrong, but they're not forces that are designed for it. And in the case of the Guard, of course, the feds can take them away in a heartbeat. So to have this Border Protection Unit that HB 20 envisions is a necessary and, I think, directed bureaucratic act, which I say in a non-judgmental way, it literally is, that focuses the resources and the attention of the state of Texas on exactly the right place.
Right. So you've answered the question of should we do it, but there's also been thoughtful discussion about can we do it?
Yeah.
Right. And this is something that I know our legislators have thought a lot about, which is everyone just assumes, or you hear this refrain all the time, that immigration and border security is a federal authority. But the reality is that Texas absolutely does retain the rights and sovereignty and the ability to have a force to protect it from, or to enforce border security and immigration laws. Tell us a little bit about the legal side of things that allows Texas to do that.
I mentioned earlier kind of the holiday from history that Texas has been able to take since basically 1920, when Mexican violence, the last iteration of Mexican violence on the border, really died down. In that interim, that basically centuries interim, in the United States, governance has moved very far away from the founders' vision of what the actual legitimate state powers of self-defense are. Now, there's no question but that the founders of the Constitution and the framers intended for the federal government to have primary responsibility for national defense and the making of citizens. But that does not follow from that they actually left states defenseless. States are not simply, waiting for Washington, D.C. for permission to exercise the ordinary plenary powers that they possess under both the 10th Amendment and under Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, which allows for a state declaration of invasion. HB 20 operationalizes a lot of those powers that have effectively gone unused. There's a Supreme Court case that I must mention here, 2012's Arizona versus the United States, which was adjudicated, we believe incorrectly, under a left-leaning Supreme Court at the time, that essentially kicked states entirely out of anything resembling immigration enforcement, to the point where you couldn't even ask citizenship status, which is preposterous. By the way. One thing that we've heard time and again from our friends on the left is that because things like HB 20 and then some of the other bills that we're talking about, 1600 in particular, challenge that 2012 Supreme Court of the United States decision, that they're somehow unconstitutional. That's incorrect. The court discerns constitutionality. It does not create constitutionality. And the Texas legislature is well within its rights to propose a, to our mind, correct theory of constitutionality and apply it vis-a-vis the border, and that's exactly what they're doing.
And so that's a good segue into 1600, HB 1600, which is the other big bill that was debated last week. I'll be honest, I was shocked and surprised to learn that this wasn't already the law, that this creates a state offense for essentially illegal immigration into the state.
Yes,
and that wasn't a thing. We don't have there's no statute in the state that says that coming into this country illegally is a state offense. Tell us maybe why that wasn't the case and what happened. Should this law pass, what does that actually mean in terms of enforcement then?
HB 1600 and its Senate counterpart, which I think is 2424. We'll double check that. To my mind,
2424.
To my mind, are the most transformative bills vis-a-vis the border and the legislature. Very supportive of HB 20, and we'll talk about 1884 in a second. But just the creation of a state offense for illegal entry across an international border to Texas is genuinely transformative because it's an assertion of state power that sets up the arguments and the adjudication that we've just talked about vis-a-vis Arizona versus U.S., vis-a-vis state plenary powers under the 10th Amendment in Article 1, Section 10. And that, I think, is the kind of the pair of bills that have the most potential to have genuine transformative effects. Now, to your question, the reason that it wasn't already a state offense is because really until the last generation, you could trust the federal government to do its job. And so there wasn't a need for it, candidly. Now there's a need. Now we know that Washington, D.C. is not going to protect the states in the Union, which I think raises a whole raft of other constitutional questions. But since it's not going to do that, the state must now step up. And the good news is that it can.
So you've got HB 20, which creates the Border Protection Unit, which is essentially the resources and the personnel and all of that to enforce the law in border regions, in the border community. You've got HB 1600 and SB 2424 in the House and Senate, the ones that create a state a violation for illegal immigration, which opens up all kinds of new authority for the state to then act and defend.
Correct.
The other big one I want to hit before we get to the invasion question, because I know everybody's just waiting to hear what you have to say about that, is SB 1884. And this targets the corruption of certain foreign nationals. So folks who are acting, and you can talk about what would be considered corrupt acts. But there's things that we can do on this side of the border in order to go after these corrupt foreign nationals, heads of cartels or corrupt politicians and so on and so forth. Tell us a little bit about that law and what that would target.
Yeah, 1884, which is a great bill, and again, one that we strongly support, is actually patterned off of what's called the federal Engel list, which has only been around for, it's been in effect for 3 years, I believe, maybe 3 to 4 years. But the Engel list is actually designed, it's an administrative list. It's designed to penalize known corrupt foreign actors who are involved in cartel activity, foreign corruption that affects the United States. But individuals for whom it's either not possible or desirable to bring a prosecutorial case against, either because you don't have the requisite standard of proof or because you can't get to them or because there's political considerations, whatever. But if you put them on the Engel list and they're subject to a series of effectively personal sanctions that actually do make a difference. Now, when the Engel list was created, they excluded Mexico from it, which sounds crazy, right? But they excluded Mexico from it again because there's sort of this D.C.-based policy sclerosis that's really unwilling to look the Mexican problem in the eye. So what we've proposed is that Texas effectively, and this is what 1884 does, enact its own version of the Engel list that specifically does target. Now the bill is written for any corrupt foreign actors, so we don't single out Mexico. But the reality is that it is intended to address specifically Mexican dysfunction, as well it should, given our position, given our relationship with Mexico. And what it will end up doing, the hope is that it will target the Mexican elites without whom the cartel trade and culture and operations would not flourish within Mexico. The reality, when you look at Mexican criminal cartels, is that they're not really against the Mexican state. They're kind of merged with it. They have this interaction with the Mexican state at every level, including, by the way, the president of Mexico himself, who has more or less open alliance with the Sinaloan cartels right now. And so to get at these office holders, to get at these elites, really, to our mind, gets at the root of the issue in Mexico. And it won't solve the problem in Mexico, but what we can do is insulate ourselves. And 1884, I think, gets a long way to that.
So this isn't just going after, El Chapo might have a safe house here, or whoever's in charge of whatever cartel, and I don't even know the names anymore. But if they have a safe house here, obviously they can go after, things like that. But this was much broader. I mean, this is whoever El Chapo is coordinating with, and they may be a business elite, or they may, and they may have assets here and own property, or they may be doing, commerce of some some kind, or maybe there's politicians and so on who
wanna-
are also being paid off, and they have certain. What other kinds of things can Texas target? I mean, I keep using that, seizing assets and things like that, but there's other things that this would allow Texas to go after to make life miserable for corrupt elites.
Texas is such a popular place for Mexican nationals in particular to park capital. And now, by the way, a lot of it is legitimate, of course. Again, as a native South Texan, there would not be a middle class in a lot of South Texas but for U.S.-Mexico trade. So we should be cognizant of that. But at the same time, to lose free access to Texas and, you name it, Texas financial institutions, the ability to
banks, okay.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, gotcha.
That's a tremendous blow to lifestyle, which is actually something that a lot in this cohort mind a lot. I'll give you one example, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned El Chapo. So El Chapo's elderly mother, God bless her, is still alive. I'm sure she's very proud of how her boy turned out. But in 2020, the current president of Mexico, AMLO, actually traveled to meet her and to pay his respects to her because he has this alliance with Chapo and the Chapitos and the cartel. And it was a public event. He paid his respects to her. Now, so he would be a candidate, to my mind, of being on the 1884 list. His son, the son of the president of Mexico, has a very opulent place in Houston. That's the kind of thing that needs to go away under what we envision in 1884.
Okay, and so that's the House in particular and the Texas legislature has this package of bills that is targeted at essentially the idea that the federal government is not coming to help us anytime soon, and so we need the resources, we need the statutory authority, and we need the tactics really, and the ability to go after and really enforce not just what's going on in the crisis and all of that at the border, but then to stop the corruption that's funding it really, and that's coordinating to get so many people here illegally, not to mention the drugs and the fentanyl and all of that kind of stuff, which is its whole other thing. Okay, all right. So now I want to get to the invasion question.
Sure.
This obviously is something that, as you mentioned at the beginning of our show, that maybe was perhaps outside the bounds of even of something to consider even a few years ago or even last year, but now has become part of the central part of this debate.
Front and center.
You have got, and take me through. If I'm getting some of this wrong, but you've got county officials and mayors of cities, writing their own letters saying we are we are being invaded.
Right.
I mean, so they're saying, even though they may or may not have the definitions right, they're trying to say, look, that we need support from the federal government, we need support from the state government. We are in fact being invaded by Mexicans crossing the border, by the cartels, and so on and so forth. But however, I think it's really important. I think this is some really fantastic work that we've done here at TPPF, is that a lot of people think invasion is just hundreds of thousands of people coming across the border all at once. It's just a lot of people coming across the border. That's an invasion. Like my house is getting invaded by ants because I've got ants coming through the floorboards or whatever. Yeah. That's not. I mean, that's sort of a common understanding perhaps, but invasion is in the Constitution, and it is there's a very specific definition that we have researched, that we have looked at. Would you, to the best of your ability, kind of take people through what is the legal, sure. It's a legal term of art. What does it mean in the law to be invaded? Yeah,
no, great question. It's something that we started to look into last year because obviously it's in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 10. States do have powers to fight invasion without immediate, and I stress the word immediate, recourse to the federal government. There's no question but that the founders intended matters of war and peace to be under the ultimate authority of the federal government. In fact, I forget what the Federalist paper is that talks about this, but it would be crazy if the Union were structured in any other way. That being said, as I mentioned earlier, the states are not left defenseless. And so what we did at the foundation here is we conducted research basically to figure out what the original use cases were for Article 1, Section 10, for what the founders understood by invasion. And here's what we ended up concluding. This is all in our published research. Anybody can go to texaspolicy.com and look up the invasion paper and see what it signifies there. But basically, an invasion, there's a few parts of this question. An invasion under the constitutional meaning requires two elements to it. It's not just entering the United States. So if I'm a migrant, I'm looking for work. I've got a brother in Portland who's got Portland, Texas, or Portland, Oregon. I don't know which is better.
Portland, Maine, maybe?
Portland, Maine. Yeah, right. Exactly. There you go. I'm not invading the United States if I'm a migrant looking for work, and that actually really doesn't. I think there's an argument that you could make that might qualitatively change given numbers, but personally I find it to be a tenuous one. So entry is one requirement, but it's not a sufficient requirement. The other portion that's required is enmity. So you have to enter the jurisdiction, and you have to have enmity toward its sovereignty in order to constitute an invading force. And so that's where we start to look at, does the Mexican case meet the entry plus enmity requirement? And we believe it does, specifically because there are ample cases of Mexican cartels, Mexican traffickers who will, you take your pick, corrupt Texas public officials, open fire on Texas public officials. We had one case where Mexican army actually entered the United States and basically kidnapped for several hours a Texas National Guardsman. That happened in 2018. And so you can go down these lists, and there's plenty of examples of entry plus enmity. And then there's kind of a larger meta question of whether the fentanyl crisis specifically qualifies as entry plus enmity. I would argue that it does, given the nature of it, given a lot of kind of what the stated intent is behind it. But all that said, that's what constitutes an invasion. And when you think about what the founders intended, what they were conceiving, an entry plus enmity, it was a very interesting exchange that I heard, I believe on the HB 20 testimony, in which one of the committee members at House State Affairs said, well, it can only be versus a foreign state power. Not true.
Right.
A foreign state power is one example of invasion, but it can also be non-state or parastate actors. And so the founders would have thought about pirates or mobs, for example, that would come and again overthrow sovereignty, even on a local and temporary basis in an area. And so cartels, which actually are connected to the state and are nakedly piratical, absolutely do meet not only the kind of the invasion definition, but also the invasion actor under the framers. So we think,
right,
based upon that, it's a slam dunk case.
So I want to dig into that second part of that, because I think that's really the fascinating part that I think people really need to understand, is that everyone kind of understands, some sort of force or some kind of sort of large body of people coming across into the state. So everybody understands you have to cross into the border. But even this idea, and it doesn't have to be just like you said, it doesn't have to be them coming after to overthrow Greg Abbott as the governor or, President Biden in Washington, D.C. It simply has to be that they now claim territory, essentially, even if it's just for regular use. It doesn't necessarily have to be that they're taking over, as part of the Mexican state areas along the border. But if they claim for their use, particularly on a regular basis, and they defend that land as part of, say, their drug trade, or as their people are crossing the border for, to push human trafficking going across a particular border, if they're constantly, destroying people's property, if they are then threatening the farmers and ranchers and saying, if you don't let me use your property, I'm going to shoot you and your livestock, or even if they're using their powers of coercion. In other words, they corrupt, say, Texas officials into forcing these ranchers and others to force them to use their land in order for them to traffic their drugs and all of that. In effect, they are now in control of the land by either coercion, corruption, or even physical harm and force. That then satisfies the definition. So it doesn't have to be, again, it doesn't have to be taking over the government or any of that. It just simply says we're gonna run our drugs across your land, and if you do anything about it, we're going to shoot you or your family, or we're going to corrupt the local government to enforce this, to allow us to do this. That meets the definition. And so and that's clearly what's going on at the border.
It is. I mean, I can name 3 Texas counties right now: Hidalgo, Cameron, and Presidio, where within the past 10 to 15 years, the sheriff's departments have been found to be essentially subcontractors to cartels. That's an overthrow of sovereignty. I can also talk to you about a woman who was on the U.S. side of the border at a place that I know very well. It's much of the Rio Grande you can essentially splash over, and somebody splashed over from the south side and told her to leave because it was time for her to go, because there was cartel guys coming through at that point, and he needed her gone. Now you may argue he was doing her a favor, and that's probably technically true, but at the same time, ask yourself: was at that moment she, an American citizen on American soil, was she enjoying the full protection of the laws and the sovereignty of the United States? I would say in no way. That's invasion. And when you add all that up and when you accrete it over years and years and thousands upon thousands of incidents, you get to a crisis to which the state must respond.
And I would add, this is not just an academic exercise of us, showing how smart we are to come up with a definition or others to come up with the definition of invasion. It actually is very meaningful, because if in fact there is an invasion going on at the southern border, then it opens up new opportunities, not the right word, new legal authorities, new legal tools for the governor to use in order to enforce border security laws that go directly to the constitutionality of Article 1, Section 10, like you said, and allow him then to basically defend the people of Texas based on the fact that there is in fact an invasion. What are some of the tools perhaps that would be available to the governor if there were an invasion declaration?
Yeah, well, without getting into too much specificity, because all this is bounded by prudence and budget, which are kind of the two unknowable things in many ways. But in theory, and actually the foundation later this year, just for your listeners to know, is going to have a research paper on state war powers. So we're going to go very much in depth to this in months to come. But the bottom line is that the state possesses full defensive war powers. I want to stress the defensive part. And so now defensive can be construed to mean a lot of different things. And certainly from a historical standpoint, it's been used to mean a lot of different things. But it's to be used for defense. And while it is underway, while that defense is underway, there must be an appeal to Washington, D.C., because we do have to preserve the ultimate authority of the federal government, even if the federal government doesn't want to do its job.
But we could fight the cartels on our side, on their side, something like that would be even within our, if the invasion of the declaration were to happen.
In theory.
In order to protect the border. It's not like we're going into Mexico in order to take over their land, so that we can, take whatever is there. The idea would be then we would be able to have operations perhaps even on the Mexico side with or without their support, because what we're trying to do is defend our border and protect our communities.
In theory. Now I want to make clear I don't think that's prudentially necessary right now, right. But in theory that is correct. And there are certainly plenty of examples from Texas history in which exactly that kind of thing happened. So we just need to be open to it. And I think one thing that we need to understand, particularly with the political dynamics in Mexico, is, and this is something that I've said many times, especially to federal policymakers and staffers on Capitol Hill, that if you just put the option on the table, it's going to have beneficial effects on the Mexican side. In no way does the Mexican state and the Mexican regime as currently constituted want the Americans anywhere near their operations, because they know that pulling on these threads is going to unspool a lot of things that they really don't want exposed. And so my guess is that, and I think President Trump demonstrated this a little bit obliquely, is that if you exhibit a willingness to get tough, that a lot of positive things are going to happen on the southern side without us having to set foot there.
Awesome. Well, Josh, thank you so much for being on the breakdown. Obviously, this number one issue, a lot of these really critical issues, we see a lot of action happening in the House. We've got some companion bills going on in the Senate. So we will keep a very close eye on this, obviously, because it's the number one issue for Texans. And we're starting to see the Texas policymakers make this a real priority for them in order to protect our communities and all over Texas, not just even at the border, but all over Texas. So thank you for helping us break down these bills today. Thank you so much for being on.
Thanks, Brian.
And thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.